today with just a few words about thinking about life after A&P. Pooja is going to talk about the programs in education here at Earlham, the MAT and the MED programs. She's going to talk for a few minutes about that. And before she even gets started, I just want to make an announcement about something completely different. There's going to be a webinar sponsored by, well, I don't know who it's sponsored by, but it's about science communication careers, journalism, science writing, public relations, outreach, teaching, I suppose, is a form of science communication, I think in a lot of ways. Anyway, there's a webinar on Tuesday, so that's next Tuesday from 2 to 3 p.m. in this room, if you would like to join others in learning from this webinar about careers in science communication. But let me turn it over to Pooja.
Thanks, Bob. I didn't know there was life after A&P. So I promised to be quick for two reasons. One is because I told Bob I would be, but also I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces, which is amazing, but some of them is because I've been in your class before. So if you've heard my spiel, just like take a nap for a few minutes. But I am Pooja Clifford, and I work with the graduate programs in education. I'm an instructor, and I wanted to come tell you about our programs because we find that oftentimes people get to like their spring semester of senior year and they're like, there's graduate school here at Earlham. So we wanted to come into classrooms early this year and tell you about it. So I'm going to tell you about 4 programs, and I'm going to go really fast to honor your time. This is a very broad overview, and I would love to answer more of your questions over email or phone or coffee. I love coffee, so this is just the broad strokes. So the first program is MAT, and that stands for Master of Arts in Teaching. It's an 11-month program. At the end of 11 months, you get a master's degree and a secondary teaching credential, which means 5th grade through 12th grade, at least in Indiana. A few things I really love about the MAT program. One is that it's cohort-based, so that means you start in June with the same people you go through everything with and end with in May, so they become like your family, like logistical support, emotional, social, so that's a really kind of like tight-knit feature of the program. Another amazing thing about the program is the theory into practice, like everyday connected. So a lot of master's programs are, you do your theory, you learn all about education your first year, and your second year you go to your student teaching, but you've forgotten everything you've learned about. But not with MAT. You are in the classroom all the time. In fact, by January, you've completely taken over your mentor teacher's class load, so you are there all day, every day, and your master's classes and evenings are a lot of things like, so what went well in the classroom, what didn't, how can we apply what we learned in the classroom? So it's really practical, which is the best way to prepare you for teaching. There's very close supervision, so like in my grad program, I got observed 3 times, I think. Here we are in your classroom, like at the high school or middle school, at least 10 times a semester, so it's really, really helping you become a good teacher. The last thing I want to say about the MAT program is the placement rate is virtually 100%. Last year, all of the graduates found jobs except one who's doing another graduate program because that's what she wanted to do. So that's one great thing about the program. So that's MAT. MED stands for Master of Education. It's also 11 months. With this one, you get a master's degree, but not an additional license. So this is if you're interested in education, but not classroom teaching. So this is like, you can get really creative. Outdoor ed, museum studies, athletics, coaching, nonprofit. So for example, this year we have 8 MEDs. One's a basketball coach here at Earlham. One is combining art education, food education, and early childhood education with projects in the city. One's working at Boys and Girls Club because he wants to open a club in his hometown of Chicago. So it's really the world is your oyster with MED, and we'd help you find a practicum. You can get paid for your practicum, which you can't unfortunately get paid for student teaching, even though it's a lot of work. But like if your focus is nonprofits and you're working at Girls Inc., like you do your research there and get paid for it. So that's MED. Are there any first or second years here? Hey, I won't even talk about 3+1, but it's very cool. Look it up on our website. And then I'll mention really briefly, we have an education integrated pathway, which maybe you have the credits to graduate with this, but it's basically like a cross-curricular, taking one education course, and then there's a menu of different, like psychology, outdoor ed, different courses with a 20-hour practicum. So if you think that might be up your alley, just shoot me an email and we'll meet and maybe meet with your advisor and see if we can get that on your transcript. Okay, do I have time for like 1 minute of questions?
1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute if there are questions, and I'll write my email address. And brand new pens. You're the third class to see our pen. It has like the screen cleaner, so please ooh and ah. If you're interested at all, you don't have to sign up, but if you sign up, that means I will send you an email just saying hey and asking if you want to learn more about the program. So if you're interested at all, please sign up. And maybe 30 seconds for questions now.
You may know Olivia Honigman. She's in the program this year. And Mitchell, the guy who was sort of in charge of CST last year, he's also in the program.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are others that I'm not thinking of right now.
They're doing great. So Olivia actually has 2 placements. She's in the middle school and high school teaching biology. Yeah. And Mitchell's at Richmond High. Cool, well, I'll write my name on the board and some other contact info. And please reach out anytime. Thank you all for your time.
So I'll let the sheet work its way through the room, have it come around here to at the end, and then you're welcome to stay, but you're also, you probably have other things that you're more.
I'll learn a little bit.
Okay, so a few announcements while that sheet is working its way through the room. One is in lab today, we're going to be doing a case study. Some of you may have already seen the case on Moodle, so we'll be going through the case. And I have a special, something new and special this year. I went to a family funeral yesterday, and my cousin, who I hadn't seen in about 55 years, is an interventionist cardiologist. So I said, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I knew that, but I said, what do you do? And he said, he basically treats heart attack. And he treats heart attack with stents, and we can talk about what stents are. So I said, okay, well, I've got this, tomorrow I'm teaching this case study on heart attack. Tell me what your day is like. And so he told me about his day, and which was interesting, and so I learned some things, and the electrocardiogram is a key part of his day. And then he sent me some coronary angiograms. Do any of you know what an angiogram is? An angiogram is an X-ray technology where they infuse a dye into the blood to make it very opaque to X-rays. And so they can see the coronary arteries. They can see because they become very dark. And so he uses coronary angiograms all the time to identify where the block of the coronary arteries is, the cause of the heart attack. And then he uses that to help him place the stents that are needed to cure this person of heart attack, at least, yeah. So, so we talked about heart attack. We talked about the role of the electrocardiogram. He sent me some coronary angiograms, which we will use in lab this year for the first time. We'll see we'll see what a block looks like, what a heart attack looks like to a physician. So that's pretty interesting. I've never been able to do that before. So we'll spend about half the lab talking about the heart attack case study, and then we'll spend about the other half of the lab as in a group going into the cadaver lab to look at the heart, refresh memory about what it looks like, I might quiz you about anatomy because that's coming up. So we won't split up into the subgroups. The whole group will do the case study, in pairs or groups of 3, and then the whole group will go and take a look at the heart. And then, that's it. Questions about lab today? Okay, case study. Using what you know about cardiac physiology to learn about cardiac pathophysiology. You have a problem set due on Sunday. In the problem set, so this involves both, so it's about the heartbeat, it's doing a problem with the electrocardiogram, so you're going to be using actual electrocardiograms to learn from. Answering some questions. On the final question, it asks you draw a schematic line drawing of the arterial system, part of the arterial system. So I just want to clarify what I mean by schematic line drawing. Thanks, Pooja. what I mean is, so it's asking you to draw the arterial system and label it. And it gives you a bunch of labels, like aorta is A, and axillary is AX, and brachial is BR, etc. So what I mean is, here is a schematic line drawing of the heart. Here is a schematic line drawing of the aorta. Here's a schematic line drawing of 3 things that come out of the aorta, etc., etc., etc. That's what I'm talking about. If you want to make it beautiful, fine, but that's what I'm talking about. And then you would label it. This is A, etc. I'm not going to give you any more answers. That one you need. Okay? Just want to make that clear. Art skills are not necessary. Okay, problem set, due on Sunday, as always, in the CST. I'll make sure there's an envelope. So a note to put out an envelope. Then, exam on Thursday, a week from today, in class. We'll spread out a little bit in here, and we'll do the exam in class. Key concepts were at the front end of the Moodle, and I've made another copy of the same file, or another copy of the link at the bottom. Key concepts list. When you're studying your cardiac or your cardiovascular anatomy, use the key concepts list for cardiac anatomy and vascular anatomy. The coloring book has more than you need to know. The key concepts list is your guide to what you need to know. Questions? Okay, so today we're going to focus on, well, we're going to spend just a few minutes reviewing the Wiggers diagram, and then we're going to get into the control of blood pressure. So let's just do the Wiggers for a minute. Okay, question. What events mark the beginning of atrial system? Somebody tell me an event on the Wiggers diagram that marks the beginning of atrial system. John, is your hand up, or are you just holding your hand out? Okay. Yes, Daisy.
Is atrial an atrial of blood flow?
Okay. That is true. That is a true statement, that in atrial systole, blood is pumped from atria to ventricles. But what do you see on the Wiggers diagram that reflects that?
The AV valve should be open at the time.
The AV valve should be open.
AV valve, and of the pressure of ventricle should be overcome the atrium.
If the pressure in the ventricles, I'm just using your words to make sure we're talking the same page. If the pressure in the ventricles were higher than the pressure of the atria, then the AV valves would close. And that's not what you just said. So. But do we see opening of valves anywhere on the Wiggers diagram? We don't really. Well, sometimes we do. We'll see that in a minute. So I'm still not hearing what I see on the Wiggers diagram. Most of what you said was true, but it's not things I see on the Wiggers diagram that tell me the events that show me the beginning of atrial systole. Tyrell?
Is it the P wave in the ECG?
Yeah, the P wave would be an event that would mark the beginning of atrial systole. Is there another event that I can see on this? Well, this little blip of volume, the pumping of blood from the ventricles from the atria into the ventricles. This little step in ventricular volume would mark atrial systole. And you could say, well, you said beginning, so you would say, okay, this little bit right there would mark the beginning of atrial systole. You see what I'm talking about?
You said increase in blood flow to the ventricle? Increase in blood flow to the ventricle?
Yeah. increase in blood flow to the ventricles is being reflected by an increase in ventricular volume. There's nowhere here that we measure flow. We're measuring pressure, volume, electricity, and sound. Okay, so that's the sort of things that mark the beginning of atrial systole. Okay, what events mark the beginning of ventricular systole? Let's do the same sort of thing.
Pressure increases in the ventricle.
Pressure increases in the ventricle. So this would certainly be something that would mark the beginning of ventricular systole. The QRS is the electrical mark of the beginning of ventricular systole. One more really good one.
Sorry, what was the first one you said?
The first one was this rapid rise in pressure, the isovolumetric contraction.
The volume kind of stays the same.
I'm sorry?
The volume of blood in the ventricle kind of stays the same.
Okay, well, sure, but there's no event that I see. I mean, it's true. What you just said is true. So so we've just identified this point in time and this point in time as the beginning of ventricular systole. But there's no event here that I mean, it's true, but I don't really see an event. What else do I see, though, at this point in time?
Would it be the first sound?
The first heart sound is another good marker for the onset of ventricular systole. It's the closing of the AV valves. That marks the onset of isovolumetric contraction, which is the beginning of ventricular systole, which was what the question was asking for. Okay, so that's how so these kinds of questions are good to use to probe your understanding of the Wiggers diagram, and then to use the Wiggers diagram to understand the heartbeat and what's going on. When does ventricular ejection start? John?
When there's a dip in ventricular volume.
Okay, so when let me use a different color. When ventricular volume starts to fall, that's when that's the beginning of ventricular ejection. What point? Okay, so that's true on this graph. What has to be true on the pressure graph for the beginning of, or the start of ventricular ejection?
This time I think I can say the right one. So the aortic pressure and the ventricular pressure is almost the same as theory.
Right.
So it should be over.
The ventricular pressure is a little bit greater than the left ventricular pressure is slightly greater than the aortic pressure that opened the semilunar valves, and that is when ventricular ejection starts, when ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure. So right there is another mark of ventricular ejection. We don't see it. We don't see it on the QRS complex, and we don't see it on the sonogram. Everybody with me on that? Just clean this up. What events mark the end of ventricular systole? The ventricular volume. So here is that. I mean, that's steep. That's falling steeply. Is that the end of ventricular systole?
No, it's at the
Okay, so at the baseline is a mark of the end of ventricular systole. I'll apply that. Morgan? The second heart sound is a good marker of the end of ventricular systole. The T wave is the electrical event. The vector of ventricular repolarization marks the beginning of the end of ventricular systole. Good. Yeah. Those are. And what else?
pressure in the aorta becomes higher than
Pressure in the ventricle falls below pressure in the aorta. Those are 4 good markers. In fact, those are 4 good markers of the end of ventricular system. When does ventricular ejection end? When does ventricular ejection end? Yeah, right here, this really marks when ventricular ejection ends, and this marks when ventricular ejection ends. Right, so the last question sort of overlaps the third question, fourth question. This marks that ventricular ejection ends because now the pressure in the ventricles is below the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. We're not seeing that. And ejection ends when there's no more blood being pumped out. The volume is isovolumetric. Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that are good to work through to understand the Wiggers diagram. And this list of questions is not comprehensive, but it's some of the most important questions. Questions about these? Questions or about the Wiggers? All right, so now we're going to talk about pressure and flow. Or talk more about pressure and flow. So maintaining blood pressure, and blood pressure, the jargon is mean arterial pressure. That's just blood pressure. Maintaining blood pressure is the most important thing that the heart can do because it's maintaining pressure which maintains flow, and especially it's what maintains flow to the brain, which is what you need to live. And so it's, maintaining pressure is really the job. Maintaining flow is important, but maintaining pressure is what the heart does. And does anyone know the name of this relationship from physics? It's got a name, but but you're not thinking of it now because you think of it in a very different context. I'm trying to break open that silo. Does anyone know? So if I say flow rate is often marked with an I, and I say resistance is usually marked with an R, what does that look like? B, what's the name of that law? Ohm's law. This is Ohm's law for fluid flow rather than electricity flow. So you already know, many of you already know it, but the way to think about it is flow, whether it's electrons or fluid. Resistance is resistance, whether it's resistance to electron flow or resistance to fluid flow. And pressure is analogous to voltage. Okay, just that, I don't want to make a big deal about Ohm's law, but it's the same concept. So pressure is equal to flow times resistance. So now let's turn it into some cardiovascular terms. Pressure is equal to cardiac output, because that's flow, times systemic vascular resistance, because that's resistance. So we're going to talk about systemic vascular resistance. We're not going to talk too much about pulmonary vascular resistance, but it's there too. And cardiac output is the total flow, right? It doesn't flow without output. So cardiac, the amount that the heart is pumping out, cardiac output, is a flow term times a resistance term gives you a pressure term. I'm going to use this over and over again. So I'm just sort of telling you where we're going, and then you'll see how we got there. So, and cardiac output is the rate times the volume of each beat. Stroke volume is the name of the volume that is pumped per beat, right? So we have beats per minute times milliliters per beat This is heart rate in beats per minute. And this is stroke volume in milliliters per beat. And so you can see that what we get is a term cardiac output in milliliters per minute, which is cardiac output. I'm just using a units analysis to help it make a little bit more sense. Beats per minute times milliliters per beat gives you mils per minute. Rate times stroke volume, that's per beat, gives you the cardiac output, which is volume per time. Questions? And so, if we take this equation and plug it into this equation, we get the overall equation. Pressure, and there's a squiggle because there's some fudge factors that I'm going to ignore, so it's not exactly equal, but it's close enough for us. Pressure is rate times stroke volume times resistance. That equation, this information will be key for understanding for the exam. Okay? So let's use it some more. Let's understand it some more. Because control of pressure is what the cardiovascular system does. So now we're trying to pull things together from the very beginning of the class till right now with this new concept of controlling pressure. So here's a flow chart from your textbook. Your textbook likes these flow charts, and sometimes they're useful, and I think this one is. So let's work our way up. It says begin at the top, but let's try it a different way. Let's start at the bottom. We're trying to understand cardiac output because cardiac output is a product of stroke volume and heart rate. Just said that. Just say it again. So now let's try to understand how the body controls heart rate, because control of heart rate is part of controlling cardiac output, which is part of controlling mean arterial pressure using the equation that I've erased. So let's just mean arterial pressure is approximately equal to stroke volume times heart rate times systemic vascular resistance. So we're going to see this over and over again. So now we're trying to understand this component of this equation. Trying to understand heart rate. You already know a lot about heart rate. What do we see in this? So here's heart rate, a component of cardiac output, right? Okay. So you already know a lot about how heart rate is controlled. You had this on a problem set. How is heart rate controlled? Well, it's the sympathetic nervous system controls the heart rate. Somebody tell me the story. Let's do this in gory detail. Somebody tell me the story of, or somebody just get this, let's get the story started. Stress. Okay, there it is, stress. What nervous system is activated? Sympathetic nervous system. What neurotransmitter is released by the sympathetic nervous system? Norepinephrine. What type of receptor does norepinephrine bind to in the heart to have the heart respond to stress? Beta 1 adrenergic receptors. I'm going fast because you already know all this. What type of G protein is coupled to beta 1 adrenergic receptors? GS. So GS alpha. What happens to GS alpha? Skipped conformational change, but you know what happens. What happens to GS alpha? Say again?
GDP dissociates GDP.
Dissociates GDP. So GDP comes off, and what happens? GTP comes on, GTP binds. You can draw it any way you like, but GTP binds, and so GS alpha becomes activated. alpha subunit of GTP, of the alpha subunit of GS, the alpha subunit of GS, which is now activated, dissociates from beta gamma. Okay, so beta gamma come off. These are all events. Draw it however you like. What does the activated alpha subunit do? Remember, that's got the GTP on it. Adenylyl cyclase activates adenylyl cyclase by binding to and releasing the regulatory subunits. What does adenylyl cyclase do? Makes cyclic AMP from ATP. I'm skipping, I'm leaving some things out, but you know they're there. Okay, what does cyclic AMP do? Oh, just wait a second, I got this wrong. Alpha, I said something wrong. Alpha subunit, activated alpha, activates adenylyl cyclase by binding to it, not regulatory subunits, I got ahead of myself. Cyclic AMP binds to the regulatory subunits of pKa. So now we're activating pKa. Okay, I'm going all the way back to the beginning of class because it matters now with the heart rate control, which matters for blood pressure control. What is pKa phosphorylates? It's a kinase. What does it phosphorylate here? Phosphorylates voltage-gated calcium channels. What does the cyclic AMP do in addition to activating pKa? Oh, I didn't know. IH. It activates IH. So IH activity is increased, voltage-gated calcium channel activity is increased. This by direct binding of cyclic AMP, this by being phosphorylated by pKa. What does this do to the ultra-slow rate of slow depolarization in a pacemaker cell? Increases the rate of ultra-slow depolarization. You'll have to decode this. Right? This is the rate of ultra-slow depolarization of a pacemaker cell. It goes from there to there, steepens, gets faster. What does the increase in voltage-gated calcium channels do to threshold? Lowers threshold. So it gets to threshold sooner. So it fires an action potential sooner. We just saw the heart rate increase. Okay, so this was all review, or almost all of it was review. Questions about the heart rate control? Because what we've just done is unpack this arrow. And in fact, we've also unpacked this arrow because epinephrine and norepinephrine do the same things to beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So we've just covered this arrow and this arrow for the heart rate control. We're going to ignore this arrow. It's still true. Parasympathetic nervous system activity is decreased, even as sympathetic nervous system activity is increased. But we're just not going to pay attention to it right now. So we now have all of the information we know to understand how the sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate. And you know that if we increase heart rate, we're going to increase mean arterial pressure by this equation, which is what you're doing when you think about the exam next week. Increasing your heart rate by saying the exam next week is going to be really hard. And I just increased your heart rate. I just increased your cardiac output. I just increased your mean arterial pressures because more blood is going to your brain so that you can learn more in order to make that exam not as hard as I'm telling you it is. Okay? So now to doing the same thing. Now we're going to unpack these arrows. Well, let's do this arrow first. Sympathetic nervous system increases stroke volume. Well, it's already on the board. What term on this board do I need to circle in black that tells me how this arrow works? One word here, it's not a word, it's an abbreviation that tells me how the stress and the sympathetic nervous system increases stroke volume. Calcium channels. We're not talking about pacemaker cells anymore, but it does that too, just as I walk through it. Now we're talking about activating calcium channels in ventricular myocytes, the pressure generating cells, the volume flow generating cells, the things that pump. What does increasing voltage-gated calcium channel? So let's walk through this, maybe a little bit more detail. Voltage-gated calcium channels in a non-pacemaker, in a contractile. So increase voltage-gated calcium channels does what?
Doesn't it increase the equalization?
Okay, so it increases the duration and the amplitude of the plateau. Yeah, that's true. We can answer the question without it, but that's a true statement, so I'll put it on the board. What else does it do?
It attaches to yeah, so the
Say again?
DHP receptor.
Yes. Well, so voltage-gated calcium channels are the DHP receptor.
Okay, so the duality.
Right. So it increases calcium release from the SR. That's key. More voltage-gated calcium channels, more influx, more calcium release from the SR. Okay, now what? Now we're probably off and running. More binding to troponin, more conformational change of troponin, more cross-bridge cycle, and I'm just going to leave it as a cycle. I'm going to leave it as a shorthand, but you should know what the cross-bridge cycle is. Right? You should be able to unpack the cross-bridge cycle. But let's not do that today. We'll run out of time, but you should be able to do that. I'm just telling you. More cross-bridge cycle, more forceful pumping, more volume gets pumped with each beat. That make sense? So now we have increased the stroke volume. And we have increased mean arterial pressure. So I can tell you the exam next week is going to be really, really hard. Your hearts are beating faster, they're beating stronger, you're increasing your mean arterial pressure, more blood is going to your brain. Your brain is really thankful that you're getting all that oxygen because it's working really hard to make sure that you learn this stuff. Okay, so we have covered this arrow using principles that you already know about. Now I have to introduce a new principle to understand this arrow. Okay, so now this is all new. Well, okay, sorry. Here's a cartoon from your book. It summarizes what we just talked about in terms of contractile. Right? Beta adrenergic receptor, alpha, right? It's all here. It's in a cartoon format. So your book does what we have on the board in cartoon. PS alpha, there should be a GTP there, activating adenyl cyclase, cyclic AMP, PKA, phosphorylates, calcium channels. But there is a new concept here. Phosphorylates, calcium channels, more calcium influx, more cross-bridge cycling. But what's going on here? We've got, well, more calcium release, there it is. There's more calcium influx, more calcium release, more cross-bridge cycling, right? That's the story we just told. But we also have, well, is it showing? We also have more calcium being pumped. Well, what happens at the end of a beat? What causes the relaxation at the end of a beat? Reuptake. The calcium has to get reuptake, or else the beat never ends. And if the beat doesn't end, you don't have enough. Then you don't have another beat. You have to have the end of one beat in order to get the next beat, and you need the next beat to keep living. So the point here is that PKA, in addition to stimulating calcium, also stimulates the uptake of calcium so that the beat can end. So what we see is that a control beat, this is looking not at electricity, but at force as a function of time. Here's a control beat. Here's the effect of increased calcium. Voltage-gated calcium channels, more calcium release, more troponin activation, more forceful beat. And here is the effect of more calcium reuptake. We need the beats to be faster, or stronger rather. We knew we needed them to be faster, but here we're seeing they need to be stronger, and they need to end on time, or maybe even sooner. Is that clear? We need to increase calcium in order to get it stronger, and we need to increase the reuptake of calcium in order to speed up relaxation. And this happens faster than this happens. Why? Because channels are faster than pumps. We're focusing on circuit. PMCA is also stimulated, but we're focusing on circuit. Questions? So, I've explained why the heart beats faster, and why the heart beats stronger, and why the heart relaxes faster when you are stressed. And you need all those things for effective increase in cardiac output, which is effective to increase arterial pressure. We're going to talk about stroke volume by the end of the day today. We will. But there's also a new concept, because I need you to understand this arrow. Why does volume affect volume? Why does the end diastolic volume affect the stroke volume? This is new, this is a key concept. You can't figure it out. So I'm asking a rhetorical question now, and now I'm going to answer. Graphically, it looks like this. This is the stark. No, there's a name for this, and it's not stark. It's blanking on the name of the physiologist that discovered this relationship. There is a relationship between stroke volume and end diastolic volume. Let's go all the way back to the Wiggers diagram. Where is, well, it's labeled. Here is end diastolic volume. It's the volume at the end of diastole. After the volume has been pumped out, we have an end diastolic volume. I'm sorry. This is the end systolic volume. This, I screwed this up bad. Let's start that over again. You rewind, erase. This is the end systolic volume at the end of a contraction, an end of systole. This is the end diastolic volume at the end of diastole, at the end of refilling. Okay? I'm going to do that again because I screwed up the first one so bad. This is end systolic volume. This is end diastolic volume. At the end of diastole, at the end of refilling, there's a volume. And now what I'm saying is that this volume, which can be higher or lower, affects the stroke volume. This is stroke volume right here. From the volume at the end of diastole to the volume at the end of systole, that's the volume that got pumped. That's stroke volume. And so if I raise and lower this, I affect stroke volume, obviously, in part, but there's something that's not obvious, which is what I'm trying to teach very well. If stroke volume, if end diastolic volume increases, stroke volume increases. Up to a point. There will be a point of negative return that is pathological, but physiologically, we are working in this range where if we increase the end diastolic volume, we increase the stroke volume. And there's one way to look at this. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to go all the way back to the Wiggers diagram. Again. One way is obvious. If I increase the end diastolic volume, but I give it a good long systole, right there I'm increasing stroke volume. So that makes sense. Okay, so that's easy to understand. And the other way to understand this is to know that the heart, that there is sort of an optimal overlap of the myosin and actin filaments in the cross-bridge cycle. So if the filaments are too stretched out, let's start here at this end. If the filaments are too stretched out, that is to say there's minimal overlap of myosin and actin, minimal possible cross bridges, low force can be generated. That makes sense, right? If we don't have a lot of, if my hands can't grab onto the thin filaments, I can do all this wiggling I want, but we're not going to have any contraction because I have to be able to grab onto thin filaments. On the other end, if the cells are too short, if they've contracted, there's physical bumping into each other. The thin filaments are banging into each other. And so contraction is impaired. The more they're already contracted, the less they can contract. The idea here is that the thin filaments are interfering with each other, preventing further contraction. And in between, we have an ideal situation. Maximal overlap of thick and thin filaments, not bumping into each other yet, maximal contractile possibility. So if I go back here, we are working in sort of this, we're working in this range. We are working we are working physiologically, we're working between, you know, a normal value and a slightly stretched out value. That actually helps us get a more forceful contraction, which increases stroke volume. So you can think of this easy, you can do it the easy way. You can do it the easy way, which just means going back to the Wiggers diagram and knowing that increasing the end diastolic volume can increase the stroke volume. Or you can do it the molecular way, which is to understand the mechanism for that. They're both true. They both work. The point is, ventricular output, cardiac output, depends on the end diastolic volume. Let's take a break, and we're going to come back to the thing that I ended class on Tuesday with, which is why does the pressure, we're going to finally get to that thing about stretchiness, remember? Why does the aortic pressure stay high during diastole? Okay, let's take a short break and we'll get to that. Pressure in the aorta stay high even though the pressure in the left ventricle has fallen below. The answer is the aorta is stretchy. It has elasticity. It has compliance. You've heard about compliance, right? You know, you may or may not be compliant with a rule or a regulation or with a drug regimen or whatever that. Well, so we're using a different term of the word compliant. Compliant just means it is more elastic. More compliance, more elastic. So here, this is supposed to be a cartoon of the aorta. What valve is this? What's the valve at the beginning of the aorta? The aortic semilunar valve. So during systole, the aortic semilunar valve is open and blood is pumped into the aorta. It stretches. Then during diastole, the elasticity tends to collapse it, just like a balloon tends to collapse when you stop blowing into it. The blood would go out either way, but the blood flow can't go backwards because of the aortic semilunar valve. And so the blood continues to flow because the pressure is now being maintained not by the ventricular pressure, but by the elasticity. Okay? And there's a term, there's an equation. There's an equation that defines compliance. The equation that defines compliance is right there. It's the change in volume for a given change in pressure. Right? So more elasticity means a stretchier aorta. It would stretch more under a given pressure pulse, and that would suggest that it was more compliant. Okay? You will need to use that equation at some point. But that's the reason why the aortic pressure stays high. Okay, so now as long as we're talking about aorta, let's talk about vascular. Moving from the heart into the vascular system, more and more. It's all part of the same system. The vascular system is not just a bunch of tubes. The vascular system has control mechanisms of its own. So here are pressure oscillations in the systemic circulation and in the pulmonary circulation. Okay, so during diastole, the pressure in the left ventricle is low. During systole, the pressure in the left ventricle is high. Low, high, this is just heartbeat. In the ventricle. Well, this is in the ventricle. Now we're going into the major arteries. The pressure in the major arteries is, I'm sorry, the pressure in the left ventricle, I just screwed this up too. If I was talking about the pressure in the left ventricle, does it stay up at 80 during diastole? Does that make sense? Does the pressure stay up at 80 during diastole in the left ventricle? No, it goes almost to 0 in the ventricle. But in the aorta and in the major arteries, it oscillates between 80 and 120 because of elasticity. So if I were to add the ventricle, if I were to add the ventricular story onto this, I would say during systole, ventricular pressure is 120, and during diastole, it's 0. So I would say here's the curve for the ventricle. Now we're moving into the arteries, and the pressure is oscillating between 80 and 120. 80 approximately. Some of you are 60, some of you are 70, some of you are 80 millimeters of mercury, the units of pressure. Okay, so I screwed that up, but I hope I'm clear. The pressure is changing. As we move into from the arteries into the tiny little arterioles, now the pressure differential, the pressure is dropping steeply because of resistance. And the pressure differential is dropping because of resistance. And eventually, in the veins, the pressure is low. So if I were to plot mean arterial pressure, let's just say this is mean arterial pressure. Here is mean pressure as we're going through the arterioles, going from smaller to smaller to smaller to smaller vessels, smaller and smaller arterioles. Now we're in the capillaries. Now we're in the veins, right? So I can just sort of simplify this. This is now a time average. In arteries, arterioles as we go through the arteriolar system, capillaries as we go through the capillary system, veins, little venules, and then veins. Yeah.
When we talk about pressure dropping because of resistance, with Ohm's law, what resistance?
Okay, so we're going to get to that in a second. The Ohm's law is going to be important for understanding this. So let's do a clicker. Why are the pressures in the pulmonary circulation so much lower than in the systemic? So much lower than in the systemic circulation? What am I looking at? I'm looking at why are the pressures in the systemic circulation so much lower than in the pulmonary circulation? Why is this so much higher than this? Show me your answer. I'll give you a hint. There's one best answer. Okay, this was hard. The best answer is C. Let's go through this. The pulmonary circulation has higher resistance, just doesn't. The arterioles, so most of the resistance, so I'm now teaching, most of the resistance in a circulatory system is due to arterioles, and pulmonary arterioles are very similar to systemic arterioles. So that's not true. The right ventricle receives and pumps less blood. Well, if that were true, I mean, it's all one circulatory system. So if that were true, then blood would have to be pooling up somewhere, and that doesn't happen. The pulmonary circulation is pumping exactly the same volume as the systemic circulation. And if that's not true for any length of time, blood is accumulating somewhere, and that would be bad. So B is not true. Everybody clear on that? Because I saw some B's. This is true. Why does the right ventricle generate less pressure? You saw it, it's thinner. It's got less muscle. It can't generate the same force. The left ventricle has all that massive muscle tissue. It's stronger. Why does my flexor pollicis longus generate less force than my biceps brachii? It's a smaller muscle. Same concept. The right ventricular muscle is smaller than the left ventricular muscle. And D doesn't make any sense.
But it's so funny.
Okay, so now let's talk about blood pressure for a moment. So I'm switching gears a little bit. We're going to talk about blood pressure. How many of you have ever had your blood pressure measured? Part of the standard physical. I don't think you'd be allowed into Berlin College if you hadn't had a physical exam that included the blood pressure measurement. So the blood pressure, what artery are they measuring the pressure of when they're measuring your arterial blood pressure? The brachial artery. So they're putting that cuff around your arm and they're measuring the pressure of your brachial artery. And it's a measurement of your systemic arterial pressure because the brachial artery is connected to the axial artery, which is connected to the brachiocephalic artery, which is connected to the aorta. You know, it's all connected, right? So we're basically saying we're using the brachial artery because it's relatively accessible to measure arterial blood pressure time courses. So brachial blood pressure is going up and down between 80 and 120 millimeters of mercury. 120 during the systole, 180 during diastole, right? Just turning this flow chart into something that you already understand, which is this one. Okay. So what does the physician or the nurse or the technician first do when they measure your blood pressure? They pump the cuff up a whole lot. They pump it up so it's really super tight. It might even hurt. So they pump it up so high, the pressure in the cuff is so high that it's greater than your systolic arterial pressure. If the pressure in the cuff is greater than the pressure in the tube, the brachial artery, what's going to happen to the brachial artery? It's going to collapse under pressure. And that's what they're doing. They're putting a tourniquet on your brachial artery, and because they are putting the pressure so high that there is no blood flow through the brachial artery. It's collapsed. It's been squeezed shut by the external pressure. No blood flow, no sound. They're listening, or the machine is listening, or the nurse or the technician or the physician is listening to, do I hear anything that sounds like flow? No flow, no sound. They're listening for silence to make sure that they've gotten above your systolic pressure. And they go to like 300, and they don't even have to listen. They know it's closed. Then what do they do? They start slowly releasing the pressure. They're slowly releasing the pressure in the cuff. They're slowly releasing the pressure in the cuff. At a certain point, the pressure in the cuff falls below the very peak of your systolic arterial pressure. What happens when that peak of systolic pressure for just a moment is greater than the pressure in the cuff? A little squirt of blood. What does that squirt of blood make? A sound that they hear, and they say, okay, I just detected, and they can measure the pressure. We're not seeing it, but they can measure the pressure. They've got a little dial, and they say, okay, as soon as I hear that first sound, that's the pressure of systole. Because now the pressure in the cuff is equal to or just below the pressure in the artery, because they hear that little squirt of blood. So they say, okay, 120, or in this case, 118. Then they continue to release it, and the sound gets louder. They're hearing the sound, and you can feel it. You can feel your heart beating now. You can feel the blood squirting through this slightly compressed arterial brachial artery. And they continue to release it, and they continue to release it, and then, so it's still making a sound because it's still a little bit compressed. Why is it making a sound? Being a little compressed, turbulent flow. But eventually, the pressure is really goes below the low point. Is there any compression now at any point in time? No. Is the brachial artery usually nice, wide, and open? Yeah. Blood is flowing through the brachial artery in a laminar way. Does laminar flow make any sound? No. And so they're listening for the end of the sound. So the beginning of the sound tells them the systolic pressure, and the end of sound tells them the diastolic pressure. And now they have 120 over 80, or in this case, 120, so they would say it's between 118 and 120 and 78, 120 over 78. And there's an art to this, hearing it, knowing how fast you're releasing it, maybe back adjusting. Machines can do this, you can buy at CVS a little machine that will actually detect the sound and report the values. We've got them in the lab. If you're interested in your blood pressure today, we can. I'm sure there are people who say that machines do a better job than any human can do listening, and there are people who say that, oh no, the machines are way off compared to what a nurse or a nurse technician can do. I'm not going to get into that debate. Me.
So if I'm getting this right, like we can create the pressure which is like higher than the systolic pressure by tightening.
Pumping up the pressure in the cuff.
Then how could we create such a low pressure that is like even lower than we have?
Well, so we pump it up so that it's higher, and then we release it until it goes down to 0. And we know the pressure in the arterial system is never 0. If it's 0, you're dead. We can do it in lab today. So the next slide is a strict definition of mean arterial pressure. Remember, that's what we're trying to understand is arterial pressure. I used to ask students to learn this. I'm not. So you might say, so if I were to say, if I were to ask you, how would you measure mean arterial pressure? You would say, well, I'll take the systolic pressure, and I'll take the diastolic pressure, and I'll just make the average. And you'd say, okay, that must be the average arterial pressure, the mean. And the point is, that's not the way it's really done. I'm just telling you now that, but I'm not going to test you on this, okay? But so you know, so that I can feel good about teaching you stuff, the point is, you spend more time in diastole than you spend in systole, and so the mean is weighted twofold on diastole relative to systole. That's all it is. We're gonna make a mean, and we're gonna time weight it for the fact that you spend more time in diastole than in systole. So and if you think that through, it comes up with this equation. It's the mean arterial pressure is the diastolic pressure plus 1/3, not 1/2 of the pressure differential. Okay? Don't worry about it. Not a key detail. But the mean is not just the average of systole and diastole. Okay. Vascular system. I'm going to do this pretty quick. We'll come back to this on Tuesday, but I think you need to know this for the problem set. So that's what I'm doing now. So the vascular system is highly branched. I think I started this at the beginning of the session. I mean, the beginning of the section. You know, the aorta branches into major arteries, which branch into arteries that don't have names. So the major arteries and the major veins have names that you're learning, but the other arteries don't, and arterioles don't. And arterioles, there's first order, second order, third order, fourth order arterioles. What do I mean by order? I mean an artery branches into other arteries, branches into the two primary arterioles. This primary arteriole branches into two secondary arterioles. This secondary arteriole branches into two tertiary arterioles. The branching is incredible. And you can see that in this amazing picture, this amazing micrograph. But the point is, there's all this branching until you get to capillaries. What are the names you have to know? Well, aorta and major arteries, and vena cava and major veins. Those are the things that have names. And the coloring book and my list tells you what the names you do need. And you'll use those names in the last problem on the problem set, the schematic line drawing. So let's end. I want to get to Yunju's questions because it's a key point. Let's end with this. But let's not get hung up with these wiggles. Let's think about systolic, the means, and now I'm going to use the correct mean. So the mean systolic pressure is somewhere around here. I'm sorry, the mean arterial pressure is somewhere around here. Then over the course of the arterioles, it drops like that. Over the course of the capillaries, it drops like that. Then veins, venules, then veins. Which part, so A, B, C, D, this is a clicker. Which part of this circulatory system has the greatest resistance? The answer is on the board if you use Ohm's law, which I will put on the board. E is equal to I, R. Another form to think about it is delta V is equal to current times delta R, a change in voltage, change in resistance. Which part of the vascular has the highest resistance? Show me your answer. I want to see if any of you can do this in your head. Not very many. So the answer is B. I thought maybe you saw a couple. Now I'm seeing some B's. So, because in this way of looking at this, it's the slope, the slope of the change in pressure that has the highest resistance is the one that has the highest slope. Let me say that again. The part of the system that has the highest resistance gives the highest change in pressure. The highest change in resistance, the highest by change, I mean from the beginning to the end of that tube, of that set of tubes. This is the change in pressure over the arteriolar circulation. This is the change in pressure over the arterial circulation. So there's no change in pressure. So this basically has no resistance. This has high resistance. But here's the key point. It's the arteriolar not the capillary, not the tiniest tubes, but the arteriolar tubes that have the highest resistance. And they are where we will control where the blood goes. So on Tuesday, I will talk about using this valve, that arteriolar diameter and arteriolar control, and arteriolar control of pressure, using Ohm's law, just like you suggested, is where we control where the blood goes. Okay? We'll do that on Tuesday. We'll pick up with the last slide. This is the last slide. This is where we will start. All right, I'll see you at 1 or 3 o'clock. Case study.